A judge insults a black man in court. He has no idea that the man is a legal genius and a powerful revelation is about to unfold. If you believe black brilliance should never be underestimated, hit that subscribe button right now. The hum of quiet murmurs filled the courtroom of Fairdale County like the background noise of a restless storm. Rows of wooden pews creaked as observers leaned forward, whispering assumptions about the man who now stood alone at the defendant's table. He didn't look like a man who had any business being there, at least not as his own attorney. Quincy Boyd's suit was faded at the elbows and 2 sizes too large, the hem of his pants brushing the tops of old leather shoes polished more by time than effort. His hands were steady, but his eyes held a quiet storm beneath their calm surface. As the court clerk called the case number, a wave of skeptical glances passed through the room. Some nudged each other. Others shook their heads. A few even chuckled softly, believing they were about to witness a slow unraveling. Then Judge Walter Kingsley stepped in. He was an aging man with silver hair combed tightly back and a thin mustache that twitched whenever he disapproved of something, which was often. His long black robe flowed behind him like a cape as he ascended the bench. Once seated, he adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, peering at Quincy as if he were a math problem that didn't belong in an English class. "You sure you know what you're doing?" the judge asked with a voice drenched in sarcasm. The corners of his mouth curled upward, but there was no kindness in the smile. "This isn't one of those TV shows, Mr. Boyd." A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom like a breeze through dry leaves. Quincy didn't flinch. He stood straight, lifted his chin slightly, and replied with the same calm he had rehearsed in front of a mirror every night for the past 3 months. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. "I've chosen to represent myself." His voice was even, his tone respectful. Still, the judge scoffed and made a note on his docket, shaking his head as if he were already preparing a dismissal. On the other side of the room, the opposing counsel, a tall, well-dressed man named Edward Langston, let out a snort of amusement. He strutted to the front of his table, unbuttoned his sleek navy blazer, and dropped a thick stack of papers with a loud thud onto the desk. "Let's get this over with," Langston muttered under his breath, loud enough for Quincy to hear. But Quincy didn't respond. Instead, he slowly reached into his old leather briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad, its edges worn and pages covered in tightly packed handwriting. He placed it in front of him and smoothed it out, the act so deliberate it felt ceremonial. What the courtroom didn't know, what no one had bothered to ask, was that Quincy had once worked as a janitor at Barton University. Night after night, after scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins, he sat in the back of empty classrooms and listened. He borrowed textbooks students left behind and photocopied chapters in the campus library. He listened to lectures through cracked doors and, over time, began tutoring struggling law students who mistook him for a peer. He never corrected them. Now, in this courtroom, years later, he was ready to use what he had learned. As Langston began his opening statement, confidently pacing and gesturing like a man who'd done this 1,000 times, Quincy listened closely. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift in his seat. He simply watched. Every sentence Langston delivered with pride, every dismissive glance at Quincy's worn suit, every time he misquoted a regulation, Quincy wrote it all down. Judge Kingsley barely concealed his boredom as Langston painted Quincy as a squatter who had refused to vacate a property rightfully reclaimed by the housing firm. He described Quincy as confused, likely bitter, and tragically unprepared to deal with the responsibilities of legal ownership. Quincy looked down at his notes and underlined 3 words: misrepresentation of facts. When it was finally his turn to speak, Quincy rose slowly. He walked to the podium like a man aware that each step mattered. His heart pounded, but his face showed only resolve. Before he opened his mouth, Judge Kingsley leaned forward with a sigh. "Make it brief, Mr. Boyd. The court's time is valuable." Quincy looked up, expression neutral. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. He didn't speak in fancy legal jargon. He didn't try to impress. He simply laid out facts, slowly, clearly. He pointed out inconsistencies in the timeline Langston had presented. He questioned the validity of the notice of eviction, referencing a city housing code from 1984 that was still in effect. Kingsley rolled his eyes, interrupting several times to question Quincy's sources. Each time Quincy responded by politely offering printed copies of municipal codes or documented case law he had dug up from the Fairdale County Archive. "What's next, Mr. Boyd?" the judge asked after one such interruption. "A Wikipedia page?" "No, Your Honor," Quincy replied calmly, sliding a photocopied law book page across the table. "This one's from the Ninth Circuit Housing Authority Legal Reference Manual, 2012 edition." Langston's smirk faltered, just slightly. Quincy returned to his table, flipped a few pages on his pad, and prepared for what came next. The judge moved on quickly, not wanting to give Quincy any credit. He turned to Langston and motioned for him to proceed. Quincy noticed it immediately, how Judge Kingsley didn't ask him if he had anything to add, how the court stenographer was already looking away. He was being pushed aside. But Quincy didn't protest. Not yet. He watched instead. And he waited. Throughout the day, Quincy observed the way Kingsley favored Langston, how he allowed certain objections without proper reasoning, how he glanced at his watch while Quincy spoke but leaned forward when Langston did. At one point, the judge even mispronounced Quincy's name as Quinton, and when corrected, waved it off like it didn't matter. But to Quincy, every moment mattered. Every word said and unsaid was another piece of evidence, another item in a growing list he was collecting not just for this trial, but for something bigger. By late afternoon, the courtroom had grown tired. Spectators shifted in their seats, whispering about the outcome that seemed inevitable. Quincy returned to his table and reviewed his notes again. He didn't show it, but he was angry, not loud, fuming anger, but the quiet, controlled fire of a man who had seen this pattern before. A system that always bent against people like him, and judges who assumed their robes made them untouchable. He reached into his folder and briefly touched a sealed envelope he had kept hidden until now. Inside it were transcripts, audio recordings, and an official complaint already filed with the State Bar Association, timed perfectly to trigger if the judge made one more procedural error, but Quincy didn't plan to use it just yet. He'd wait for the moment, the right one. Because the courtroom may have seen a poor man defending himself, but Quincy Boyd saw something different. He saw a machine with cracks, and he came with a wrench. Only those who stand with justice and respect intelligence over ego will subscribe. Are you one of them? The doors to courtroom 3 swung open with a quiet creak that somehow echoed louder than it should have. The second day of the trial had arrived, and with it came an undeniable shift in atmosphere. Gone was the smug laughter that had filled the chamber just 24 hours earlier. The spectators, many of whom had shown up for the sheer spectacle of watching an underdog fall, now whispered among themselves with uncertainty. Quincy Boyd entered slowly, wearing the same humble brown suit from the day before, but something about his demeanor had changed. He walked taller, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. He paused just briefly as he passed the prosecutor's table, his eyes locking briefly with Edward Langston's. The smugness on Langston's face had dimmed overnight. He still held on to the belief that the system was rigged in his favor, but something about Quincy's silence the day before had unsettled him. It wasn't weakness, it was patience, calculated, almost surgical. Judge Walter Kingsley shuffled papers on the bench with exaggerated impatience, glancing at his watch before glaring at Quincy. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, just loud enough for those in the front rows to hear. Quincy ignored the jab, stepping up to the podium with his yellow legal pad pressed tightly in his hand. He took a breath and began. "Your Honor," Quincy said, his voice calm, measured, "I would like to begin by outlining the violations committed by the plaintiff, Fairmont Properties, LLC, in their pursuit of eviction." Judge Kingsley sighed audibly and leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Boyd, you do understand this is a court of law, not a classroom lecture?" Quincy didn't flinch. "Yes, Your Honor. That's why everything I'm about to say is supported by statute, precedent, and official filings." There was a faint shift in the room, heads turned, not because of what Quincy said, but how he said it. With control, with knowledge. Quincy moved with purpose. He opened a folder of neatly organized papers, carefully selecting the top document. Let's start with Fairdale Housing Code 17C, first passed in 1984. This ordinance requires that any notice of eviction be served by a registered agent of the property holding firm. According to the documents submitted by the plaintiff, specifically Exhibit B, The notice was signed by an employee whose license expired 3 months before the date of service. Langston shifted in his seat. Quincy continued. Furthermore, the address listed on the notice doesn't match the address of record registered with the county clerk's office. That's a direct violation of procedural accuracy. If I may submit Exhibit D, highlighted in blue for your convenience, you'll see the clerk's certified copy of the original deed. He handed a copy to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. The courtroom had grown still. A few jurors leaned forward, their pens paused mid-note. Judge Kingsley scanned the document briefly and looked up with a forced chuckle. "Mr. Boyd, the court doesn't have time for your Google research." There it was again, the dismissive sneer. The assumption that intelligence could only wear tailored suits and polished shoes. Quincy met his eyes, unwavering. "This isn't from Google, Your Honor. It's from the county recorder's office, certified 3 weeks ago, and it directly contradicts the timeline presented by the plaintiff." Judge Kingsley frowned, but before he could reply, Quincy reached for another paper. "Your Honor, I'd now like to submit Exhibit F." He held it up, a thick, official-looking document bearing a gold notary seal. "This," Quincy said, stepping forward slightly, "is a notarized copy of the original deed, which proves that I remain the co-owner of the property in question. The transfer that was supposed to remove my name was never formally executed. No revocation was filed. No notification sent." A wave of murmurs broke across the courtroom. Langston's face drained of color. "That document was never part of disclosure," he objected, standing abruptly. Quincy turned to him. "It was filed with the county 2 days before your motion to evict. If you had done due diligence, you'd have seen it. Or perhaps you did see it, and hoped I wouldn't." "Order!" Judge Kingsley barked, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the unease that had crept into his chest. He looked down at the envelope with Exhibit F as though it might explode in his hands. Quincy's tone changed now, not louder but heavier, each word delivered with intent. "I also filed a motion 2 days ago with the State Bar Association." The judge's head snapped up. "I included audio recordings from yesterday's proceedings, including interruptions, dismissive commentary, and your mispronunciation of my name despite repeated correction. I've also included transcripts where you denied me procedural rights afforded to all defendants, rights that, if denied consistently, create a pattern of judicial misconduct." The air left the room. A court clerk to the left of the judge blinked in disbelief. Langston tried to object, but his voice caught in his throat. Quincy turned back to the bench. "This isn't just about my case," he said, his voice rising ever so slightly. "This is about how people like me are treated in rooms like this, where the value of your argument is measured by your shoes and not the truth in your words." The doors opened. All heads turned as a sharply dressed man in a navy suit walked in. He moved with quiet authority, his ID badge clipped to his breast pocket. Without a word, he approached the bench and handed Judge Kingsley a sealed white envelope. The judge took it reluctantly, his hands trembling slightly as he broke the seal. Silence. His eyes scanned the first page, and whatever color remained in his cheeks vanished. It was a formal notice from the State Oversight Commission. Quincy had triggered an official review of his courtroom conduct. The judge leaned back slowly, the weight of the moment pressing into his spine. He didn't speak. Couldn't. He looked down, not at Quincy, but at the table in front of him, as if trying to escape the moment. Langston finally spoke, but his voice was paper-thin. "Your Honor, I moved for a recess." The judge didn't respond. He simply nodded to the bailiff, who looked more stunned than anyone. "Recess granted," he whispered, as if afraid the walls might be listening. But the damage had been done. By the end of the afternoon, the courtroom had emptied. The case had been dismissed on grounds of improper process and judicial bias. Fairmont Properties was fined for their conduct, and a recommendation had been submitted for their licensure to be reviewed. Judge Kingsley, once the untouchable titan of Fairdale County Court, now faced an inquiry that could end his career. Quincy walked out quietly. Reporters waited at the steps, cameras flashing, microphones raised. He passed them without a word, his legal pad still clutched in one hand. A few people in the crowd clapped softly, others simply watched in silence. Quincy Boyd hadn't just won his case. He had dismantled a system that bet on his silence. He didn't need to shout. He simply waited for the moment when the truth would be loud enough on its own. He didn't need a lawyer, he became the law. If that moment gave you chills, subscribe and join the fight for respect. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to shed light on the importance of respect, intelligence, and the fight against racial prejudice. Its purpose is to inspire conversations about fairness, equality, and the need to break down assumptions in all walks of life.